Welcome to Bad Apple of the Bunch, a new series here on Whoniversals where I take a look at Doctor Who stories that are generally disliked or considered subpar by fandom and viewers in general, despite being penned by critically acclaimed or beloved writers, and analysing how said writers missed the mark on those particular instances. Now, this series isn't intended to shame these creators for having a fluke misfire. No matter who we are, all artists are bound to have a bad one in us. Well, unless your name is Terrence Dicks. May his immaculate, flawless output stand the test of time forevermore. But still, I do think it's interesting to see someone so well renowned for delivering high quality content just inexplicably clock out for an installment or two. And that is certainly true of the subject of this first episode. I don't think it's an understatement to say that David Whitaker is one of the most formative writers in all of Doctor Who. Not only was he the show's very first script editor for the first 10 stories spanning around 50 individual episodes, but he also penned The Edge of Destruction and The Rescue, a pair of two-parters that, on a surface level, may just seem like bottle episodes only there to kill time between larger, more extravagant productions. But in terms of characterization, they are absolutely vital for showcasing the course of the First Doctor's mellowing demeanour and his shifts in dynamic in respect to his newly acquainted companions. While I, or anyone else for that matter, would be hard-pressed to say that they're unanimously considered fan favourites or anything to that degree, they are certainly some much appreciated glue that holds the first two seasons together, and I dare say some of the best character writing of the First Doctor's tenure. In addition to this, Whitaker also delivered the perfectly fine, but not particularly vital historical The Crusade around the same time, mostly remembered for its brutally dark tone. But if you thought that was as good as it got, whoa boy, are you mistaken. Because with the birth of the Second Doctor, he hit us with two absolutely phenomenal analyses of this newborn incarnation and the show's most formidable foes, the power of the Daleks and the evil of the Daleks. Both of these adventures are top-notch, delving into the psychological manipulative power play between the anxiety-racked but utterly determined Second Doctor and the Daleks, at arguably the most cunning they've ever been, taking advantage of humanity's greed and scientific curiosity for their own cruel ends. And as if that wasn't enough, Whitaker also provided us with The Enemy of the World, an absolutely sublime, action-packed political thriller with phenomenal characterization and world-building all around, and to this date still the show's best ever doppelganger plotline. And his contributions didn't stop in the 60s either, as his final script for the programme, while heavily tampered with by the uncredited but still equally proficient Malcolm Hulke, was the still pretty fondly remembered conspiratorial subversion of alien invasion premises, The Ambassadors of Death. So that leaves the weak link in his repertoire, the bad apple of his bunch so to speak, and the subject of today's video. The Wheel in Space. On paper, it seems like this should have been a slam dunk for Whitaker. He was writing for the Second Doctor again, with whom he had been nothing short of, well, pretty much perfection for up to this point. It was a companion introduction, which he had previously proven he could cope rather well with, and given his incredible work with exploring and expanding on the Machiavellian and insidious manipulative side of the Daleks, it was anyone's guess as to what wonders he could pull off with the Cybermen, especially since they have an even more direct relationship with humanity that one could play with. The possibilities were endless. But sadly, it seems like David Whitaker's imagination for this one was not. Hell, this story wasn't even his idea. Kit Pedler, co-creator of the Cybermen themselves, originally envisioned a Daleks vs Cybermen confrontation for this slot, but when the Daleks' creator Terry Nation refused to give the green light on that premise, Pedler instead conceived the idea of the Wheel in Space, and got David Whitaker to flesh it out into a full script. With that in mind, it may be difficult to put the blame squarely on Whitaker himself for the curiously lackluster quality of this entry, but you know what, even if Pedler had coughed up the worst idea in the world, I'd have still expected Whitaker to salvage something from it. Did he? Let's find out. First, let's take a look at the setting and supporting cast. This story does frequently come under fire for apparently having an underwhelming group of generic supporting characters, and I guess when you look at it in an extremely generalised and wider context, you can kind of see how people reach that conclusion, because the Second Doctor's era loves the base Under Siege format a lot, and often some people sling lazy criticisms at it for sticking to a format that works, and for the most part gets great results. Now honestly, I'm opposed to this particular critique. It's the same format used over and over, therefore it's repetitive and bad. I find it's a very surface level reading of the story's mere structure that fails to consider or just disregards the execution of said format in each particular installment. Prevalence of a certain story structure isn't really an issue for me. What matters to me is how each instance of that structure handles its own world building, plotting, characters, and so on. That being said, I honestly think the side characters in this story are perfectly solid. Like, sure, they are certainly rather archetypical of the bus formula. Jarvis is the strict commander whose uptight nature progressively gives way to insanity as the story goes on. Tanya and Leo are the token heterosexual couple who happen to work together. And Gemma Corwin continues Season 5's absolutely stellar trend of composed and practical female supporting characters. Now, in comparison to other stories that are in the same season, or to David Whitaker's other scripts, yeah, this story is certainly among the weaker ones for supporting casts in both cases. Whitaker is certainly capable of delivering far more compelling supporting characters, and his other Second Doctor scripts are overwhelming proof of this. But at the same time, I don't think these characters are just instantly forgettable like some feedback claims. Similar case for the setting. The titular wheel is a perfectly serviceable environment for the adventure, even if it's not the most engrossing, and I do honestly kind of forget what its main purpose even is whenever I rewatch the story, but still. As for the regulars, this is a little bit of a different outing for them, at least for the first half of the adventure. Episode 1 is basically a two-hander bottle episode, with the Second Doctor and Jamie stuck on a rocket due to the TARDIS malfunctioning, and the pair of them pretty much lounging around while a little robot boyo tries to get at them. Patrick Troughton wanted a holiday during episode 2, so the Doctor's out of commission from banging his head too hard, while Jamie does all the heavy lifting when the pair of them are transported to the wheel. Jamie previously had instances of independence in prior stories for sure, but it is fascinating to see how he handles the introductions and exploration without the Doctor's help for a change, especially considering his place of origin and how starkly different the wheel is from that. It's got endearing fish out of water vibes, I like it. This is also the point where upcoming companion Zoe joins the plot and starts building a bond with Jamie. While Troughton had got back from his holiday by this point, episode 3 has the Doctor bedbound and taking it easy, while Jamie's in hot water for sabotage. Considering the frantic panic and anxiety that the Second Doctor often displays, it is a curiously endearing change of pace for him to be so relaxed and taking it easy. Also, Zoe gets to meet the Doctor in this episode, and right off the bat they establish the teasing intellectual rivalry between the two that would blossom during their time together. Zoe herself is a prodigy, with admirable scientific and mathematical knowledge, but is rather self-conscious that her intellect gets in the way of her emotions and sours others' perception of her. This does make for a neat thematic parallel with the emotionless Cybermen, and is also her motivation for joining the Doctor and Jamie on their travels by the end of the adventure. The second half of the story does become a bit more business as usual once the Doctor is out of bed and has learned of the Cyberman menace, but honestly the regulars of the Second Doctor era could be washing the dishes and I'd still find it entertaining, so it doesn't bother me. And it doesn't seem to bother anyone else either, as the issue many have with the Wheel in Space doesn't seem to be the regulars. One of the few things that gets unanimous praise in this story is the introduction of Zoe, so clearly the problem isn't here. According to his biography, Patrick Troughton himself expressed a frustrated dislike for the Wheel in Space, allegedly describing it as dire and, the same old tired story, bashed out again. to his son Michael. His biography elaborates that Troughton was absolutely passionate about the concept of the Cybermen and the terrifyingly realistic threat they represented, but he detested whenever the production team would choose to utilise them without the accompaniment of a decent plot that would make sense for their inclusion. And in this case, I can really sympathise with his point, because of all the 60s Cyberman stories, this one by far takes the least advantage of their presence. One thing I admire about all the other 60s Cybermen stories is how differently they actually utilise the Cybermen. The 10th Planet and the Moon Base are both base under siege stories, sure, but with the 10th Planet's stronger focus on how characters interact with them, and the Moon Base leaning more on suspense and the Cybermen's stealthy infiltrative side, they do feel pretty distinct from one another. The Tomb of the Cybermen, meanwhile, changes things up significantly, and analyses their desire to preserve themselves and survive by any means necessary, which I dare say has gone down to be their defining aspect as a species and as a villain. And while the later entry The Invasion does restore them to a, well, invasion narrative, the fact that they are foot soldiers for Tobias Vaughn and seemingly in league with him for most of the adventure does indeed showcase a unique dynamic for the Cybermen that hadn't been done before. But as for the Wheel in Space, yeah, there's nothing distinct about the way they are presented here. I guess they do take their sweet time showing up and enacting their plan, but with how bluntly the direction and storytelling choreographs their presence, it doesn't really feel like there's any suspense to it. And their plan. Oh boy, where do I begin? So, the Cybermen want control of the wheel, but since the wheel has an X-ray laser to defend itself, they can't just do an upfront attack. So instead they sneakily send Cybermats on board to sabotage the weapon's fuel supply. You know what? Solid plan. Now that the wheel's defenseless and the humans are at their mercy, surely the Cybermen could now just storm in with little issue, right? Apparently not. Because instead they hijack an unrelated rocket and pilot it off course to stray close to the wheel with the intent of arousing the crew's curiosity. As this was just before the Cybermats had sabotaged their X-ray supply, the crew of the wheel were originally intending to just annihilate the rocket out of concern. But upon very conveniently spotting Jamie and the Doctor on board, they decided against it and brought them to the wheel. Then when they found their weapon supply sabotaged, just as a meteor storm was discovered to be heading their way, the crew thought to themselves, hey, you know that rocket we very nearly destroyed but oh so conveniently didn't? Well, what if it has its own supply of that substance that powers our X-ray laser? Which just so happens to be exactly what the Cybermen were hoping for, because it turns out the rocket does have its own supply of that substance, which the Cybermen hide inside of as the crew of the wheel bring it on board. Oh, and that meteor storm I mentioned? Yeah, it turns out there's a cyber fleet out there whom had deflected it in the direction of the wheel to hasten the crew's decisions and reactions. Even though humans are very prone to this little thing called error, and only barely managed to get the substance from the rocket and get their defenses working again in time, meaning the Cybermen were a hair's width away from robbing themselves of their own goal. Either way, those Cybermen that were brought on board basically vibe. I mean, they kill a few people, but they don't really do much in their attempt to assume control of the wheel, and are very quickly overwhelmed. But it doesn't matter, because the cyber fleet I mentioned earlier comes along to attempt the upfront attack thing anyway, even though the X-ray laser has now been repaired and makes instant mincemeat of them, and that's it. The Cybermen are defeated. Dave, Whitaker, honey, what is this? This plan is so needlessly convoluted, relies on so many contrivances, as well as the Cybermen just sitting around and hoping that the crew of the wheel act in a certain way, in a certain time frame, that it strains at the believability of this being a purely logical race. Don't get me wrong, I am not saying David Whitaker had a perfect track record for plotting prior to this. I mean, the actual progress of events in The Edge of Destruction still kind of leaves me at a loss whenever I revisit it, but this is easily his weakest attempt at a narrative. And look, I'm a classic Who snob. I usually sneer at people who say 6 or even 4-part stories are padded or longer than they should be, but this Yeah, nah, the Cybermen drag their plan out so slowly here for no defined reason, and you can kind of feel Whitaker straining to fill out the runtime. That is, until episode 6, when everything suddenly happens at once, and the story rushes to the defeat of the Cybermen that's basically copy-pasted from the moonbase. So, yeah. In conclusion, the Cybermen themselves, and the plotting in regards to them, are certainly the weak links of this adventure, and considering the fact that it being a Cyberman story is probably its biggest and most appealing aspect at first glance, you can probably understand why people come out of the other end feeling that it was a dull letdown. And when you consider how spectacularly well David Whitaker had handled the Daleks, it is a bit of a bummer when he gets his hands on the Cybermen and just sort of fumbles with them meaninglessly. That said, I do think everything else the story has to offer, the setting, the characters, and the material concerning our leads, is done perfectly well, and they do make the adventure worth watching, especially if you're a fan of Zoe and want to see where she comes from. That said, do I think this story deserves its reputation as David Whitaker's dud? Well, me being the Troughton era fan that I am, I obviously don't think it's as bad or as vapid as some people make it out to be. I think it's a perfectly serviceable story despite its flaws, but as for it being the weakest of his output, yes, I agree with that. Which is funny, because apparently Whitaker himself felt that The Ambassadors of Death was his weakest script, to the point that Malcolm Hulke and Terrence Dicks had to jump in and salvage it. But yeah, nah, The Wheel in Space is an overcomplex, drawn-out misfire, the bad apple of David Whitaker's otherwise phenomenal bunch. If you want to watch it, I recommend you switch over to Sexual Air Supply.